Let me begin by saying my name is Richard E. Boye, B-O-Y-E. I am an ordained pastor in the Lutheran Church. I was ordained in St. John's Lutheran Church in Joliet, Illinois in 1952. Add that up, and that means I've been a Lutheran pastor now for 58 years. During these years, I have been members of 4 churches, in effect, which merged and became finally the ELCA, which I'll explain in a minute. I was ordained into the United Lutheran Church in America. Subsequent to that, there was a merger, the LCA, which is the Lutheran Church in America. And then in 1987, I was present in Columbus, Ohio, when the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, was consummated. During that time, I have served 5 Lutheran churches, 2 of which were quite large. Over the years, things began to happen. In 1983, I moved to Minnesota to serve what was then the 10th largest church of 11,000 in the ELCA. I had, at the time, 2 associates. One of them said to me something that stunned my mind. He said, the Minnesota Synod is the sexiest synod in the church. And I said to him, my colleague, what does that mean? He would not tell me. But I soon saw what was unfolding before my eyes. What happened was, every time I went to a convention of the Minnesota Synod, they discussed gays and lesbians, etc. There was a strong element in the Minnesota Synod that I believe was probably initiating this whole thing across the United States, coast to coast. And I was just shocked at how much they talked about and how much they justified homosexual activity and wanted it in the church. One time I got so sick of listening to this that I stood up and made a motion that we accept and affirm the 10 Commandments. I actually quoted out of a previous document of the LCA. I thought that would pass and maybe clear some air. But believe it or not, it lost. During 30 years, I went to, I think, every single convention, as they were called then, and after the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church, they were called assemblies. I was a delegate twice during those times. And they always, in the corridors of the convention, had a booth which was manned, womaned, as you will, for gays and lesbians. And they would hand out literature. And sometimes I would talk to them and see what they're trying to do. But I was dismayed when the church, my church folks, refused to let organizations that were beginning to form at that time, such as the Word Alone Network, for them to have a booth. Anyway, what was happening, as I perceived it, was that the culture was changing. And people were not sticking to the Bible, and they were not truly representing their faith. Previous to the action of the Assembly of 2009, the church had produced various studies, little booklets. One was called Journeying Faithfully, kind of to ready us up or warm us up, which seemed to be becoming increasingly inevitable. And then in one devastating action, in the August Assembly, which met in Minneapolis of 2009, this finally came to fruition in a vote. The acceptance of gays and lesbians' activities as partnered clergymen, practicing homosexuals, was approved by a single vote a single vote. While this vote was being taken, I lived in Minneapolis for 15 years. There was a tornado. And I don't remember a single tornado, but this tornado came into downtown Minneapolis, crashed into the very assembly building that was in the process of debating and taking this vote. It didn't substantially denigrate that convention hall, but on a kind of a porch on the back end, it blew away tables and chairs and other things. And not only that, it skipped to the next block where stood the cathedral in Minneapolis of the Lutheran Church called Central Lutheran Church. My wife and I belonged to that church for several years while we lived in Minneapolis after I'd retired from the ministry. And literally, it blew down the cross that was high on a steeple, and the cross fell down against the tower like that. I felt, simpleton that I am, that was a sign from God. Stop. Stop. But they didn't stop. Before that, about 3 years, I ran into the presiding bishop in the airport in Roanoke, Virginia. I had known that bishop in Minneapolis. I belonged to an organization called the culture.
It's okay.
It was a group of pastors in Minneapolis and St. Paul. There were about 300 of them. I ended up being the president of that organization. And I had introduced the new presiding bishop in my responsibility. Anyway, I met him in the airport in Roanoke. And he knew that my wife was deceased and gave me condolences. And then he left for a while, and I sat there and I thought, I'm not going to have another chance to do this. So when he came out again, I put my hands on his shoulders. I looked him right in the eyes, and I said, this was a presiding bishop, mind you, over 11,000 churches then. We don't have that many anymore because of this action, I believe. I put my hands on his shoulders, and I said, the way things are going, I will no longer be able to take my offerings, and I'd been a tither since I was in high school, to take my offerings and help support the ELCA, because I felt it was no longer carrying out the Lord's work. He sloughed it off, and he said, well, some may do that, and some may increase their giving, as though it didn't matter to him at all. But after this action was taken, in August of 2009, I'd already talked to my own pastor, and I told him the same thing. And I'm not bragging about this, but I think I'm the highest giver in my congregation. And he first thought that I was going to hurt the church. That was the farthest thing from my mind. That particular church building, that congregation, those people, they're my friends and my fellow Christians. But I told my own pastor, my own bishop, that I could no longer support the ELCA. Now, I was able to work with the treasurer of my church to relocate my benevolence giving. I am still giving to my own church for their activities because I simply don't want to hurt my church. I love that church. I love the building. I love the people. But I cannot, in good conscience, give to the ELCA. I cannot. However, I am giving more to benevolence than I was even before this. And I am helping such organizations as the Word Alone Network, which has now become Word Alone Ministries and Exchange Ministries, where some Christians down in Orlando, Florida, are taking discouraged and disheartened gays and lesbians, introducing them to Jesus Christ, telling them that Christ will forgive them of all those things that they had done, and causing them to be reoriented. It happens. It works.